Well, good morning, and welcome to this ITIF Geneva Network event on the role of intellectual property rights in ending the COVID-19 pandemic. I'm Stephen Ezel, the Vice President of Global Innovation Policy at the Information Technology and Innovation Foundation, and I'll be your moderator for today's event. As ITIF wrote in a recent report, how intellectual property has played a vital role in the global COVID-19 response, right here. From vaccines and therapeutics to sidewalk delivery robots and teleconferencing services like Zoom, intellectual property has played a critical role in shepherding global society throughout the COVID-19 pandemic. That innovators like Gilead Sciences were able to bring an effective therapeutic, remdesivir, to patients a mere 92 days after the World Health Organization declared a pandemic, or that the Pfizer-BioNTech vaccine arrived 347 days after the virus was even first detected, is testament to the incredible power of IP-based innovation, especially considering that previously it often took a decade or more to innovate and develop new vaccines. Today, biomedical innovation seeking to counter COVID-19 numbers some 830 unique active compounds under development, including 360 treatments, 240 antivirals, and 224 vaccines. IP is crucial to these innovations. To be sure, it's imperative that global society receives access to much-needed COVID-19 vaccines and therapeutics. And that's exactly why innovative life sciences companies have now entered into over 280 voluntary licensing agreements with contract manufacturers in developing nations, looking to dramatically scale production of COVID-19 vaccines and therapeutics. In fact, it's estimated that by the end of 2021 alone, more than 11 billion doses of COVID-19 vaccines will have been manufactured. Yet some assert that intellectual property has created a barrier to access to needed COVID-19 medicines, with India and South Africa leading a petition before the World Trade Organization, TRIPS, Trade-Related Aspects of Intellectual Property Rights Council, for a waiver of IP rights associated with COVID-19 medicines and technologies. Extremely short-sightedly, in early May, the Biden administration regretfully signaled support for this misguided and unnecessary waiver, which will do very little to support, and in fact, may even impede the global effort not to dramatically scale manufacturing of COVID-19 vaccines. That, at least, is a perspective of the Information Technology and Innovation Foundation. We're joined today by an all-star panel from all corners of the world to discuss this issue. I'll introduce the panel now. They'll provide about 5 minutes of introductory remarks, and then we'll turn to audience Q&A. To that end, please submit your questions via the Slido application on the event homepage on the ITIF website, and we'll get your questions in the bottom half of the hour. Today, we'll first hear from Phil Stevens, who was Executive Director of the UK-based think tank Geneva Network. Before founding the Geneva Network in 2015, Phil Stevens worked at the World Intellectual Property Organization, WIPO in Geneva, in its Global Challenges Division on a range of IP and health issues. Phil holds degrees from the London School of Economics and Durham University. We'll next hear from Mr. Azrul Maud-Khalib, who was founder and director of the Malaysia-based Galen Center for Health and Social Policy. Azrul has 20 years of experience in global public health policy, previously holding positions at the Institute for Democracy and Economic Affairs, as well as a joint United Nations program on HIV/AIDS under the United Nations Development Program. He's also worked with the International Committee of the Red Cross. Next, we'll hear from Dr. Yogesh Pai, who was an assistant professor at the National Law University, NLU, in New Delhi, India, where he specializes in IP law and the interface of IP with competition, trade, and economic policy. Dr. Pai is also co-director of the Center for Innovation, Intellectual Property, and Competition, CIIPC, at the university, and he's also in charge of the IPR chair at NLU Delhi, which was established by the Department for Promotion of Industry and International Trade of the Ministry of Commerce and Industry for the Government of India. Lastly, we'll be anchored by David Kapos, who from August 2009 to January 2013 served as Undersecretary of Commerce and Director of the United States Patent and Trademark Office. Mr. Kapos is now a partner at Cravath, Swaine & Moore LLP, where he is widely recognized as one of the world's foremost leaders in the field of IP, including IP management and strategy and the development of global IP norms, laws, and practices. Before joining USPTO, Mr. Kapos held a number of executive posts in the legal department of IBM over his 25-year career there. So with that, thank you for joining us today, and I will now turn the floor over to Phil Stevens from the Geneva Network.
Hi, Stephen. Thank you very much for hosting us today. Thanks to everyone at ITIF. I just want to start by saying how delighted I am that this subject of IP and health and vaccines has suddenly become of interest to everyone around the world. I've been working this topic for many years, and now people are asking me about it at the school gates, and it's gone from a niche topic to one of great global urgency, which is exciting, and very glad that these debates are being had. So our perspective here at the Geneva Network is we're concerned about the way the debate around IP rights are going. I think there are many areas in which IP rights have been mischaracterized, and I think some people have had it wrong since the early days of the pandemic. If we cast our mind back to about a year ago, a bit more than a year ago, there were a lot of people saying that, we must get rid of IP rights because it's going to stand in the way of innovation and R&D. It will stop people sharing information. It will stop researchers from collaborating. And in reality, the exact opposite happened. We had, I think we're up to four vaccines now approved by stringent regulatory authorities. We've gone in 18 months from not knowing anything about this disease to having workable vaccines and an end to the pandemic in sight, thanks to innovation. And I think IP was at the center of that. So I think we need to be very careful about proposals such as that at the World Trade Organization, which seek to undo a lot of that by waiving IP rights. Which is why Geneva Network, with our friends at ITIF and others, have put together a short declaration on why we think IP rights are going to help end the COVID pandemic and why they're so important. If I'd just like to pull that up. This is being released today, and it makes 4 very brief points, which I think are relevant and germane to today's debate, particularly that taking place at the World Trade Organization. So one, IP rights are crucial to vaccine scale-up and manufacturing. Because IP rights allow the owners of the original proprietary knowledge to share it with collaborating partners. It enables smooth technology transfer, free from legal constraints, free from concern that competitors might run away with that knowledge for their own commercial gain. So if you transfer knowledge under an IP framework, it paradoxically, it's more rapid than if you remove it and cause a coerced technology transfer, because the people who own the knowledge will be more incentivized to transfer it rapidly in a smooth and meaningful way. IP rights allow the owners of proprietary vaccine and knowledge and manufacturing know-how to select the partners they think can produce at the highest quantities to the highest quality in a much smoother way than if there's a sort of a global scrap for this information and the materials involved. And I think IP licensing has had a great track record in the past. Most recently with hepatitis C, we've seen some quite high technology new medicines being rapidly manufactured and rolled out in many different countries, particularly in developing countries, thanks to voluntary licensing, which I think is a proven mechanism and one which is working well today. There's still more to go. There's still more deals that need to be done, but I think this is the correct way. Secondly, we're looking at future pandemics. We need to ensure there's as many organizations as possible researching and developing vaccines and other preventative medicines should the next pandemic inevitably occur. And IP rights, I think, are important because they, as we've seen with this particular pandemic, the existence of IP, in particular the requirement of a patent to disclose information, is actually quite useful because it shows to researchers what else is already out there. It allows people doing R&D to identify partners who have the right technologies, platforms, compounds. So it creates a sharing and collaborative environment, which can accelerate research and development. And particularly for companies who hold intellectual property, the existence of IP rights kind of allays their concerns about confidentiality and makes them more easy. It makes it easier for them to share that information with even potential rivals. So, as I mentioned at the beginning, the existence of IP rights will be very useful should the next pandemic comes. And we also want people to be improving and refining the existing technologies we have. For example, they don't need to be frozen or one-dose shots, new variants. There's lots. The current crop of vaccines are not perfect, and we want continued investment and refinement of those products. And I think IP rights are crucial for that. The third point, competition. So the whole purpose of the IP framework is to incentivize organizations to spot areas of market, gaps in the market, invest in those. The idea being that lots of different companies will compete within the same sort of category of product to create competing and improved vaccines or whatever it happens to be. And I think we've seen that with COVID vaccines. We have, as I mentioned, at least 4 now, and they're competing against each other for ease of delivery, for cost, for effectiveness. There's quite a dynamic market emerging within the IP framework, which I think is a very good thing and something we should encourage. But if we choose instead to remove the IP framework, we'll have the existing stock of vaccines, and then I doubt we'll see the innovation continuing. And the prices have been kept low in part thanks to this competition. I don't think anyone's been particularly complaining about the price of vaccines in this pandemic, unlike in previous public health crises such as HIV, which I think is testament to the competitive power of intellectual property rights. And then finally, the final point we make in this declaration is that the IP waiver would have no impact on vaccine production without forced technology transfer. The reason being, patents aren't the key IP right with vaccines production. It's more technical know-how and the manufacturing processes, which I'm sure we'll hear more about in this panel. A lot of that information is held by individuals in their brains. It needs to be taught, and the best way to transfer that is through voluntary mechanisms rather than coercion. If you coerce that, I think that opens up a lot of legal minefields. How do you actually force individuals to travel around the world teaching vaccine scale up, particularly when these individuals are in quite short supply at the moment and are very busy in their own organizations scaling up manufacturing for their own products. So I think there's a huge legal uncertainty there and practical uncertainty. How do you actually force companies to share know-how with rivals to manufacture COVID vaccines? I think that's a dangerous path to travel down. So those are the 4 points which, if you click on the link, which hopefully is up on the screen, you can read in a bit more detail. So take a look there and feel free to get in contact with me if you have any questions, or to share the link if you agree with this message. It's on the ITIF website and also on the Geneva Network website, geneva-network.com. So that's me. I do encourage you to take a look at that, and I thank ITIF for providing this platform. I now think we're going to head over to Azrul Mohd Khalib in Malaysia for his perspective. So thanks, Azrul.
Thank you, Philip. Thank you first to the Information Technology and Innovation Foundation for having me on this panel to contribute the Galen Center's perspective on how we see IP rights playing a major role in leading us out of the COVID-19 pandemic. As is my practice, I do apologize for being on an all-male panel. Firstly, let me start by stating the obvious. COVID-19 vaccine inequity is quite real. There are many statistics that we've heard in the media which have gone into describing this disparity. The wealthiest 27 countries in the world, which account for 10.5% of the world's population, account for 36% of vaccinations that have taken place so far. 80% of all vaccines currently produced have gone into the arms of people from high and middle income countries such as myself. 9 in 10 people in 70 countries are not expected to receive a jab of a COVID-19 vaccine this year. While countries such as Malaysia, Singapore, South Korea aim for the majority of their populations to be vaccinated by mid-2022, most of the poorer countries in the global south are not expected to be able to do so by at least 2024. There really is a desperation, especially with the recent news that India, as a result of its own COVID crisis, has placed an export ban for all domestically produced vaccines, at least until the end of the year. And that's at least 1 billion doses, which were depended on by the COVAX initiative. Nothing has been shipped since March. No one can fault them for making the decision to restrict exports. But by June, there will be a shortfall of 190 million doses to COVAX destined for lower income countries. So we need more vaccines available now and sent especially to those countries which are less able to afford them, however low the prices may be. We are, as you may have heard, racing against the virus, as it is clearly with the emergence of variants that no one is protected until we are all protected. In desperation, some countries want to have the option to make their own vaccines, hence what we now see as the proposal, the IP waiver. So what are the problems? How do we solve them? And how do we move forward? We are told that the main problem is intellectual property. One quote I read said, quote, "Millions of people will die if you don't waive the patents. Patents are the bottleneck for vaccines," unquote. But are they really? We have not seen much in the way of evidence that demonstrates or proves this assertion. The current IP waiver debate seems more of politics rather than proper pandemic interventions needed today. To combat vaccine inequity, which was foreseen much earlier and resulted in the formation of the COVAX initiative, we need to urgently plug the hole that is currently there. I would suggest that perhaps several high-income countries such as Canada, which have enough vaccines in order to vaccinate their populations with 4 doses, perhaps share those surplus doses now and would have, in fact, a far more immediate impact. The G7 nations could donate around 20% of their supplies in June, July, and August, and this alone has been estimated to provide 153 million doses for COVAX. Before the pandemic, the global demand for all vaccines was around 5.5 billion doses a year. We now need at least 3 times this much for COVID-19 alone, with continued high-scale production likely to be needed in subsequent years. And that's where the real bottleneck lies, manufacturing production. We are seeing serious challenges to manufacturing vaccines on a scale never seen before in contemporary medical history. There are a few hundred pharmaceutical manufacturing sites around the world, including in developing countries. The problem is that they're not all set up to produce vaccines in short order. And in order to ramp up production on the scale that we need, there would have to be technology and knowledge transfer, acquiring the necessary equipment, training and capacity building, upscaling, and one of the most challenging issues so far, securing the necessary raw materials to ramp up production. The ongoing discussion on the role of IP, whether it's a boon or a hindrance, is a necessary one for us to have, as it rightly forces an examination of the current systems that we have in place, especially those that are meant to correct inequity. But honestly, we would be kidding ourselves if we thought that a waiver would lead to rapid manufacturing and rollout of critical life-saving vaccines needed in the immediate future. I'm happy to be part of this discussion, and I will continue on later on in our session. So I'll pass it on now to Yogesh. Go ahead, Yogesh.
Thank you, Azrul, and good evening, good morning, everyone. It's evening in Delhi, in India. First of all, I would like to thank the ITIF and the Geneva Network for having me. It's a real honor and a privilege to be part of this panel. On the issue of the waiver, I think it's very clear from evidence that most of these vaccines are an outcome of intellectual property protection. There is no doubt about it, but there is also a situation which demands that there is access, global access ensured for all these vaccines and COVID-19 related drugs and other kinds of devices, diagnostics, etc. But having said that, I think the waiver proposal is an outcome of confusion, and a serious confusion and conflation between issues of technology access, issues of scaling up production, and issues in relation to pricing of vaccines and other COVID-19 products. And this conflation has led to a situation, and we have a kind of a proposal which would be very difficult to actually implement at the ground level, and we'll discuss this later. If you look into the situation in India itself, out of the 8 vaccines that are known globally right now, AstraZeneca, you have a license with Serum Institute, that's a voluntary license. You have the other one, that is Johnson & Johnson with Biological E. Although the vaccine production hasn't started, they're planning to bring out the doses. Then you have other one that is Bharat Biotech, which is India's indigenous one, wherein already there are doses under production, and the government of India has scaled up production is planning to scale up production through public sector and private initiatives. And you also have the ones that are not there right now are the mRNA ones, that is Pfizer and Moderna, which both are in talks. And if you look into recent news items, both these companies are in talks with the government of India to ensure that there is faster voluntary transaction in terms of trying to scale up production and initiate production. Now, if you look into this technology access related issue, it seems that voluntary licenses are 5 out of 8 vaccines that are globally recognized are already in place. The rest 2, that is Pfizer and Moderna, are in talks, and one, Sinovac, right now there has been no interest in India with reference to this Chinese vaccine. However, scaling up has been a problem, and those problems are irrespective of the question of IP, in the sense that scaling up requires a lot of inputs, technical inputs, know-how, and also material inputs and that are required for production. And then finally, there is an issue of pricing, and that seems to be one of other reasons why countries like India and South Africa have proposed a waiver, so that sans IP protection, the understanding is that it would bring down prices. But there is also a question, if without IP protection, how would these voluntary transactions that have led to almost over 1.5 billion doses being currently produced in India by the year end, that's the estimate currently, how are they going to be impacted? The reason being, already without the waiver, you have a lot of production that is already going on. It's just a question of time. And I think the idea that the waiver is going to bring further benefits in terms of technology transfer, I think is more ideological than real, for the simple reason that technology transfer and sharing of know-how requires deep synergistic synergies between two collaborating firms. And if that can't be achieved through forced technology transfer, then what would remain is still an option for voluntary transfers themselves. So I think the waiver proposal in that sense could in fact take us back to square one, where you would still require some kind of voluntary collaboration and exploring synergies between collaborating firms. Then there are further issues which I'm going to discuss through the panel, but I wanted to place my initial remarks by saying that since it is very clear through evidence that intellectual property has so far not contributed as a great barrier to technological access, if there are issues relating to scaling up and pricing, those will have to be addressed to different policy instruments. Thank you. Over to David.
Yes, good morning and thank you, Yogesh. Let me start by thanking the ITIF and saying how pleased I am also to join this distinguished panel this morning, and thank you to the ITIF also and to Stephen for giving us a platform and for spending time on this truly critical issue. So this is one of the situations, I think, as the last panelist to speak, where I feel like perhaps everything's been said that needs to be said. It's just not everyone's yet said it. So I'll try and pick out a few things that that maybe haven't quite been said yet. First of all, I want to emphasize that I hope I can speak for everyone on the panel in saying that we would all agree that rapid and equitable distribution of COVID-19 vaccines is absolutely critical to ending the pandemic. So that's not the issue. Everyone is on board with that point. The issue is that sacrificing the innovation ecosystem in order to achieve this goal is unfortunately myopic policy. Suspending IP rights won't get shots into arms any faster, and it will, in fact, undermine efforts to scale up vaccine production. And while the appeal of an intellectual property waiver is tempting in the short run, doing that actually imperils our ability to develop new medicines and vaccines to combat, in fact, future pandemics when the next one comes along. I think despite the Biden administration's support, as recently expressed through USTR, the case for the IP waiver that we're talking about here is extraordinarily weak. The nations that spearheaded the petition, India, South Africa, have been unable to provide any evidence that intellectual property rights impeded the development, production, distribution of COVID-19 vaccines and treatments. And in fact, one can't really imagine any evidence will be forthcoming, as IP is actually facilitating and not inhibiting the pharmaceutical industry's response to the pandemic. Some of the other speakers have already mentioned the many collaborations that are going on among companies that are normally fierce competitors, like Johnson & Johnson and Merck, Pfizer and BioNTech, getting Sanofi in to add to vaccine production. Even generics manufacturers working on a contract basis with innovator firms are also working around the clock. India's largest generics manufacturer, the Serum Institute, right, producing billions of doses of the AstraZeneca vaccine. South Africa's largest generics firm, Aspen Pharmacare, producing hundreds of millions of doses of the Johnson & Johnson vaccine. It's ironic, in light of all this, that India and South Africa led the petition to nullify intellectual property protections, since none of the collaborations that their companies are now involved in would have been possible without intellectual property protections. Now, to be sure, there are some very real challenges to inoculating the world, and these challenges include lack of proper refrigeration for the storage and transport of vaccines, shortage of trained professionals to administer them and conduct follow-up evaluations, lack of patient compliance with the two-dose regimen of some of the vaccines, issues like corruption and black market, vaccine fakes, and a general lack of trust in government in many places also come to mind. Suspending intellectual property rights, however, won't remove any of the actual roadblocks faced by countries like India and South Africa in their vaccine rollouts. In fact, suspension will only exacerbate those problems, facilitating the distribution of ineffective vaccines manufactured using substandard processes, administered without adequate refrigeration or professional handling, or the required counseling and follow-up. This is a moment when leaders and policymakers in the developed world need to focus their efforts on helping other nations overcome these challenges, the real challenges. Debating the finer points of intellectual property law at the WTO is a total waste of time, especially since it's a non-issue. Intellectual property protections are the facilitator of having these vaccines come to market so brilliantly quickly. They're not a holdback in any sense. And then lastly, I'll just mention as an example relative to Moderna's vaccine, it took only 2 days after Chinese authorities publicly disclosed COVID-19's genetic sequence in January, 2 days for Moderna to sequence its vaccine candidate, which was mRNA 1273, which ultimately proved 94.5% effective and became, as probably people know, one of the first vaccines that was approved for emergency use in the US and other countries. By way of comparison, to create viable vaccines for diseases of the past, smallpox, chickenpox, typhoid fever, polio, took decades, not a couple of days. Now, how was Moderna able to do this? Moderna was able to do it because it had invented a successful platform through 10 years of work in developing a messenger RNA technology capability. This in turn was the result of at least $2 billion of investment by investors in Moderna. Those investors were willing to support Moderna for many years and potentially lose billions of dollars in the process because they knew its technology could revolutionize medicine. And they knew that technology, that technology would be protected by intellectual property rules. But investment in Moderna's vaccine, while they certainly paid off, it could have gone very differently. Only 12% of investigational medicines entering clinical trials ultimately are approved in the US by the US FDA. As the average cost of developing new drugs reaches $3 billion, it's clear that no firm would conduct research and development without the promise of intellectual property rights, which of course give companies exclusive ownership of their inventions for a limited period of time. And it's that exclusivity that made the drug possible, right? So Moderna's success should be a clear lesson for every policymaker. Swift global public health responses to this and other pandemics are predicated on incentivizing research and clinical developments of new drug candidates and clinical pathways today. Thanks again, and Stephen, I'll turn it back over to you.
Well, thank you, David, as well as Phil, Azrael, and Nugesh for those excellent remarks. I want to remind our audience to continue submitting your questions via the Slido application on the ITIF event page. We have already received a number of questions, which we'll roll into at this point. I'd like to exercise moderator's prerogative to start with a couple here. And, you know, as I've said, if intellectual property has been a challenge at all during the COVID-19 crisis, it's that originally we didn't have the intellectual property and know-how we needed to combat this thing. We had to invent the vaccines, therapeutics, and diagnostics to tackle the problem, which is why I was really struck that, you know, India and South Africa submitted their petition to the TRIPS Council in October of 2020. And if you read the petition itself, it states, to date, there is no vaccine or medicine to effectively prevent or treat COVID-19. If there was no vaccine and no intellectual property at that point in time, why on earth was there a need for a waiver of intellectual property rights that didn't exist for these vaccines and therapeutics? It seems to me this was coming much more from a perspective that some of policymakers in these nations have tried to for some time to continue to advance this, in my opinion, mistaken narrative that there is actually a conflict between intellectual property and access to innovative medicines. Welcome any reactions to that point of view.
Well, Stephen, while others are thinking, I'll just say that that's exactly right. I mean, the question answers itself. You know, clearly the timing and the futility of all of this would inform one that there's some other agenda at play. And, you know, we can maybe talk about what that is, but, you know, you're exactly right. This all just doesn't add up. I think that's what you're saying.
I think so.
If I may just add on the waiver issue, even prior to the waiver, there were clear indications that there are going to be voluntary negotiations between Serum Institute, for example, and AstraZeneca, and all of this was pretty much clear. And that's more of a reason, you know, for me to worry as to why, you know, countries thought that you know, intellectual property would pose a serious barrier in a situation where there are present capacities in India to produce certain kinds of vaccines, if not all, and why those you know, production capacities would never be, you know, explored via voluntary licenses. And I think this really fits into you know, the question as to why everybody knows. The reason is that there seems to be some kind of a north-south kind of a debate that is glossed, in terms of how the relationship between IP creators and IP users, is framed, and that kind of a framing led to this, waiver proposal at the WTO. But if you really see, this is no more a north-south issue in the sense which is perceived, because you have many kinds of voluntary bilateral deals that have already been signed, and vaccine production has already taken place. Thank you.
May I as well, Stephen? Leading on from what Yogesh has said, there's a question of timing as well. So we have a waiver debate now, which might go on until October before a decision is made. By which stage there'll be the existing stock of vaccines made by the manufacturers plus the voluntary licenses manufactured, plus new products that have not yet been authorized coming on stream. By which stage the debate at the WTO might be coming to a conclusion. So then we'll have this huge stock of multiple vaccines and various manufacturing initiatives in place, and yet in October we might start thinking about implementing some new manufacturing programs via the waiver. By which stage the pandemic will be in most of Europe, the debate will have moved on, and I think in developing countries as well, there'll be much better access to vaccines by the time that the waiver actually starts delivering, if indeed it does. So I think, given the nature of multilateral discussions, they're not fast things, are they? If they wanted the waiver done, it should have been done before before these things were invented, which would have been counterproductive because they might not have been invented in the first place. So I really feel that this debate will be rumbling on when the reality on the ground will have moved on and things will be very different. So one wonders of the futility of the whole initiative.
So thank you, Phil, and Yogesh for your comments. So technically, the waiver petition would give countries the ability to not offer or extend intellectual property rights in their nations for COVID-19 relevant technologies. There is, of course, also a mechanism that exists in the WTO TRIPS, compulsory licensing, that in cases of extreme national emergency, for instance, as one condition, then countries would have the ability to use compulsory licensing in theory. The question I have with regard to this is A, why was that mechanism not pursued by some of these countries as opposed to the waiver idea? And moreover, if we are to have this waiver in place, which again is just giving the ability not to extend intellectual property rights, would there then be a view that, oh, now is the time to start to use the compulsory licensing elements to force this transfer of trade secrets and technology know-how that we've been talking about? Is this a stalking horse essentially for compulsory licensing going forward?
Well, Stephen, I guess I'll start again while others are thinking. I think that compulsory licensing would be a second step that some countries could use. But there are two other issues that I think your question is getting at. One is that the waiver doesn't really cause anything to happen. Countries still need to take actions of one form or another. It turns out that while I can't speak to every single country, most of the countries that would potentially take action, there aren't intellectual property rights available in them anyway, or that patents haven't been registered in the applicable drugs in those countries, so it's actually irrelevant. And the second point, and I hope we'll discuss this in some detail, is that the real issue is the tech transfer, as has been brought up a bit already. And there's absolutely no mechanism that I know of by which any of these countries is going to somehow go into, let's say, the United States of America, for example, and compel the disclosure of the trade secrets by Moderna. I don't know how that's going to work, and that's the long pole in the tent, as we say.
Stephen, if I could just add to what Dave said just now, certainly when we see countries like Malaysia, where even though the IP waiver were to happen, it would still require some sort of legislative or regulatory move on the part of the Malaysian government in order for that to actually happen. And we would also then have the next question that would be asked, which is, you waive the patents and you got the blueprints for the vaccine, but it doesn't give you the know-how or knowledge or skilled workers, even if you do have the equipment, and you're stuck. You can't move beyond getting those in place because you just don't have the kind of equipment, the technical and logistic issues that need to be overcome. We're talking, all you have to do is look at Moderna. Back in October 2020, I think, they basically said that they wouldn't challenge any kind of utilization of their vaccine to be reproduced at a local level. They said they wouldn't challenge it, and nobody took it out. Nobody did, So it goes to show that you can talk about it from a theoretical standpoint, but when it comes to the actual practice or the implementation of that, it's a huge barrier that needs to be overcome, especially those countries that need it the most.
I think it's also important, if I may, it's also important to understand the nature of laws in some of these jurisdictions. For example, India, even if patents are granted on vaccines, because process patents are not available on vaccines in India, but product patents are, even if patents are granted, the law says that you cannot initiate any infringement action until the patent is granted. And it takes usually 4.5 years, 5 years for a patent to be granted. That is one. Second thing is, even if a compulsory license were to be granted, you would not have real access to know-how. And I think Azrul and Dave made the point that access to know-how is important. So even if a waiver goes through, there would be a requirement under the domestic law of countries like India to engage in mandatory or forced technology transfer of those technologies that are already in the country, residing in India. So now the question is, if there are technologies that are outside the country, how are you going to ask the US government to force their companies to share technologies with India? Because the waiver, I'm sure it would come with an opt-out provision, just like, for example, the Article 31 BES kind of provision where in the TRIPS agreement, where countries had opted out. Similarly, you would have a situation where countries such as the US and other countries would want to opt out of the waiver. And if they opt out of the waiver, and then you have this problem of cross-country technology transfer, how are you going to still ensure that? That's not going to happen. So there are these technical difficulties of and legal difficulties in operationalizing the waiver on the ground.
There's also the regulatory dimension. India being a case in point, I believe, correct me if I'm wrong, has not yet approved the Pfizer vaccine for use in the country.
Yes.
Yet, we're discussing the IP rights of that vaccine when it's not actually approved. But say the technology were transferred to a third party in India via a coercive mechanism, that product will then have to go through new fresh regulatory approval, which could add many months to the process of getting into people's arms, which seems a bit silly, given that there are other ways of doing it which will be less time consuming and more rapid, which is speed is the order of the day. And I think the waiver and speed are not necessarily two words that go together, I don't think.
So I think we're in violent agreement that the developed world has a moral and ethical responsibility to help ensure that all of global society has access to the needed COVID-19 vaccines and therapeutics. And we also agree that the IP waiver is not the best way to go about doing that. So in that case, what should developed nations be focused on to help the rest of the world tackle this problem? Do we need to increase funding for COVAX? Do we need to provide just money for countries to buy these purchases? What else can we do to help expand production? What should be the most important policy priorities for policymakers in actually trying to tackle this problem?
Dave, you want to go first?
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, I think Stephen, what we're already seeing here in the U.S., a move by the administration, I think it was just last week, to say, we're going to invest in helping American companies rapidly scale up manufacture for, of course, at this point, it's virtually all for distribution overseas. That's exactly what's needed here and in a few other countries, especially in Europe and to some extent in other places, I would say especially India. There's tremendous know-how and manufacturing capacity, and scaling up that existing capacity under the agreements that we've all mentioned are either in place or can be put in place is exactly the thing that needs to be done. It'll be far more effective and fast at getting the vaccines out into people's arms.
Absolutely. So I quickly wanted to add a couple of things, again, based on evidence. I think there is already an initiative of the US Development Finance Corporation as far as Johnson & Johnson and Biologically, which is an Indian entity, is concerned. So I think there is an agreement to fund around 1 billion vaccines. If, as and when the production starts, I think this is one step, towards achieving non-waiver kind of solutions towards scaling up. There is also a question, I think, in scaling up about underwriting the risks. So if governments are not willing to underwrite risks in terms of upfront purchases, etc., I think the initiative needs to come from several other countries towards through COVAX or through other kinds of funding mechanisms.
Stephen, if I could add on to that, we're talking about ramping up manufacturing, developing new sites. These would be the medium and long-term solutions, and what we need right now, and I think I said in my opening statement just now, we need short-term remedial measures. We need something that needs to address the gaps that that we're starting to see as a result of the shortfall created by the withdrawal of India from providing COVAX, and we're starting to see that now. G20 just met and put together a pledge. I think they said that like the EU would donate 100 million doses and invest in regional manufacturing hubs in Africa. I think at that meeting, Pfizer, Moderna, and Johnson & Johnson would supply around 3.5 billion vaccine doses at low cost or discount to low and middle income countries this year and next. So if you add those commitments from the G20 meeting with what I said earlier in my opening statement, we have quite a lot of things that we can do now, things that we can result in actual impact in addressing the gaps in terms of the vaccines that we need shots into arms today. And, talking about IP waiver is just going to be a distraction. It won't solve anything, really. And at the end of the day, it will actually erode some of the fundamental infrastructure that we need looking at the next pandemic. Today we're dealing with this pandemic, COVID-19, and we're starting to make a lot of compromises, and which we should not make. And we need to be able to look at the next pandemic. And today, there's a lot of things that we can already do, and we're starting to hear some of those solutions now.
Great. Let me read some more of our audience questions. I'm going to try and combine a couple here together. Who has the larger role today to balance the need to protect one's intellectual property and the dangers of vaccine nationalism, the government or the firm? There's also a related question. Why did pharma contract with nations facilitating nationalism rather than COVAX directly? It says a solution that doesn't transfer know-how must address nationalism. Let anybody take any part of those questions. It seems they're roughly getting at this notion of vaccine nationalism and how do we avoid that?
Well, I suppose it's the way that the pandemic's played out. When it first started, urgency was the name of the game, and I guess individual governments were more nimble at negotiating on behalf of themselves, and it's taken a while for multilateral initiatives to build that head of steam which is required. But the past is the past now. I think we need to think about the future, and I think multilateral initiatives are probably the best way for the developing countries to gain better traction in their vaccination programs. So I think the shift needs to accelerate now. There needs to be more funding. There needs to be more political priority for these multilateral initiatives. It's not like they've never been done before. There's Gavi, there's PEPFAR, sorry, that's not multinational, that's a US initiative, but there's the Global Fund. We have great experience of mass procuring medicines for use in the developing countries. So some of the lessons need to be learned from those organizations. And the past is the past, and we need to think about the multilateral more clearly now. Now we have the products. So I think that's the way forward.
You know, Steve, I think there's another metaphor to be employed here. We've all been on airplanes and heard the announcements that are given before takeoff. You know, if the plane loses pressurization, oxygen masks will come down from the ceiling. Please remember to put your own mask on first before helping others. And there's that metaphor is apt here. In the sense that those countries the developed countries that have the responsibility to help the rest of the world needed to first get on their own feet. And there's some sense of, you certainly can't blame them for doing that. And it benefits the rest of the world when those who have the biggest responsibility to help, and I think that's countries like the US, certainly, are aggressive about getting on their own feet first so that they can help.
You know, on that point too, David, I was struck by here in America how quickly it went from not enough vaccines to in a 3-week period. We have all the vaccines we need, and there's vaccine hesitancy, or there's public health infrastructure challenges in getting shots to people who need them. I think one way that the developed world really should be thinking about helping, because we will solve the vaccine supply problem, will then be really partnering with developing countries around the world to help build out their public health infrastructure so that they can actually get physically shots into arms of people. I think that should be a much more significant part of our vaccine diplomacy than is currently being construed. A question from the audience. European countries seem far less sanguine about the wisdom of a waiver, and G20 countries also have misgivings. Is the waiver option really a non-starter at the WTO?
Honestly, the short version of it, yeah, it certainly would not. It certainly would be. And that's why I think we're wasting time discussing. I mean, it's necessary debate to have, but honestly, it's distracting us from the actual issue of increasing production.
If I may add to Azrul's comment, I think the waiver proposal is also a failure of multilateralism in coming out of the pandemic. So waiver was proposed in October, right? And you had a pandemic at least 6 months before that. And during those 6 months, we really need to see what concrete and workable solutions based on voluntary transfers and building up scaling facilities, were possible at that point of time, without even thinking about phase 3 trials, etc., and regulatory approvals. That was very critical. One of the other mistakes, for example, because of these individual approaches, for example, what India did was to put its bets on Novavax, and the vaccine is even not out as yet. So, and you had to get 1 billion doses through Serum Institute and Novavax deals, and that didn't happen. So I think if your energies are all diversified because of individual national positions on vaccine production, I think you would not go anywhere. And I think this pandemic has showed us that. I think there is more need for multilateralism and more talking to do within the government's entrapment dialogue.
A question from the audience, are voluntary licensing agreements a feasible option? Another one, private and public sector entities have signed something like 200 technology and production licensing deals. Isn't this a better approach than coercion? I think we've addressed this in the panel. Welcome any additional comments, but it does seem that the voluntary licensing approach has been effective in terms of allowing the innovators to work with contract manufacturers to validate that they will be able to effectively and safely manufacture vaccines at scale with the needed technology and expertise they need. And this is true both on the vaccine and therapeutic side. You look at a company like Gilead Sciences that innovated remdesivir, and they've got generic license agreements with manufacturers from Egypt to India to Pakistan that are producing remdesivir for 127 different countries. So welcome to their thoughts, but it does seem the voluntary licensing approach has been effective in this crisis.
May I, Stephen?
Yes.
I mentioned the regulatory dimension. There's also the trade dimension. A lot of vaccine manufacturing bottlenecks are caused by manufacturing export restrictions. Input materials, ingredients, and the US as well being guilty of, sadly, of imposing restrictions on exports. I think maybe the WTO would be a good forum for resolving those issues, and probably a more positive and near-term win than the waiver in boosting manufacturing by allowing goods to flow freely amongst supply chains. So yeah, they have the regulatory dimension, which I mentioned. Also, the trade dimension is also equally important.
I just wanted to add quickly on the remdesivir question in India. For example, last month we had a huge, scarcity of remdesivir, and the reason was because between December and March there was a lull in demand for remdesivir, and the 20 plants that were the licensed plants in India, Gilead's 7 licensees were operating 20 plants, and they scaled back production. And to suddenly increase production to, it would require 4 to 5 weeks, and that kind of strategic stockpile was not maintained. And that's one of the reasons you had a sudden demand for remdesivir, and which could not be suddenly produced. But now you have 57 plants through these licensees, and I think remdesivir is no more a problem. So voluntary licenses actually help, and I think if there is a other issue of scarcity, it may relate to non-IP kind of issues that needs to be tackled head on.
So we have about 5 minutes left. What I want to do is read one final audience question. And then after that, ask each of you to provide a closing comment or remark. Could be your most important recommendations for policymakers in the United States or your own countries or elsewhere in the world, or what you view as next steps in the situation. So think about your closing remarks. Here's our last question from the audience. What can the developing world do today to build their capacity to produce vaccines and medicines and eventually participate more greatly in innovation?
You want me to go first?
Yeah, go for it, Yogesh, and maybe Azrael.
Okay. So I think the developing countries need to invest in technology absorption first, because that's a prerequisite for any kind of technology, to be scaled up, and especially in the context of vaccines. And I can give you one simple example. India's own Bharat Biotech has produced Covaxin, which is a vaccine for COVID-19. And if you look into the technology is a very old conventional platform. In fact, one of the oldest conventional platforms, which uses active virus and inactivates it. Now, the problem with Covaxin has been that, unless you have biosafety level 3 facilities, you can't actually scale up the vaccine. And the time it takes to scale up is, higher when compared to other kinds of vaccines developed by AstraZeneca or other companies. I think there then needs to be serious introspection as to when there is a necessity, what kind of investments are you going to make in technologies, whether you want conventional platforms or more modern platforms to that can achieve easier scaling up. And there needs to be substantial time and investment that needs to be done in these kind of activities. Thank you.
Well, I'll add on to that. The fact is that countries are at different levels of development of their life sciences sector. And there's no shortcuts. I mean, we're talking about, decades of investment that we're talking about in terms of education, making sure that there's the technology and knowledge transfer that we mentioned just now, acquiring the skill sets, the expertise, the capacity building, the necessary equipment. All of this comes and plays a role in how a country is able to participate in the development of vaccines and medicines. I have no problem imagining that Malaysia, for example, will have that capacity to be able to take part in such an endeavor in the future. I mean, Malaysia just made its virgin debut into human vaccine mass production through a fill-finish arrangement with Sinovac recently. But the reality is that you need to make the investments. You need to do the legwork. You need to train people, and you have to do the time before you can yield the results. So if people are looking for shortcuts in this, there just aren't any.
Yeah, Stephen, if I could just add one quick thing to that, providing an accommodating and reasonable regulatory regime for investment by the big players that are able to research and develop and manufacture vaccines, to create, in particular, manufacturing facilities, since, as we've all discussed here, it's the manufacturing that's the issue. It seems to me to be another component of activity that developing countries can invest in that is doable on a shorter term basis, in order to encourage the Pfizers and the Johnson & Johnsons and the Modernas and the AstraZenecas and the folks from India and South Africa to actually put production facilities in their country. So I'd just add that recommendation.
And we should also mention an effort that ITIF operates in collaboration with the Geneva Network and the Center for the Protection of Intellectual Property at George Mason University Law School. And this is an Innovate for Health initiative, where we now have over 50 case studies of innovators in developing nations whose ability to innovate in the life sciences were empowered by their nation's introduction of stronger intellectual property laws. There's a wonderful story in the set of case studies from Brazil. The Cordinia verbenacea is a flowering bush plant on the northeast coast of Brazil. And for centuries, local fishermen have known that if you mash up the plant, and you can use it as a topical analgesic. But though this was known, nobody ever actually took the effort to isolate the active ingredient, because intellectual property rights patents weren't protected in Brazil. Once Brazil joined the World Trade Organization, the TRIPS introduced patent rights. Lo and behold, Astraflan was made, and now the Brazilian company controls 30% of the global marketplace. A wonderful story of the introduction of intellectual property rights directly leading to the capacity to innovate, because innovators know that their investments can be protected. All right, well, we're about at or over our hour. I think this has been a wonderful discussion. I want to thank our panelists for participating. I'll ask you to each leave us with a closing thought for global society as we move forward on this difficult issue. Let's go in the order of how we started today with our speakers. So Phil, Azrael, Yogesh, and close with David.
Yeah, we're at a delicate stage in the pandemic. There's a lot being done, but I don't think it's the time to be reshuffling the deck completely via the waiver. I think IP rights have been quite instrumental in getting us to where we are today, and we should let them continue doing their job.
Thank you, Phil. Azrael.
Thanks, Stephen. Thank you, everyone. I mean, today with COVID-19, I think David alluded to it earlier. It's remarkable. We have several vaccines which were developed and produced in record time and have already reached people in more than 170 countries in less than 100 days from the first approval. We haven't done a great job, though, in making sure that the production keeps up with demand. As I mentioned earlier, this is unprecedented. So to boost vaccine availability right now, it would be better to address global vaccine production capacity. That's where the problem lies. That's the bottleneck. So let's sit down and solve that. Thank you.
Yogesh.
Thanks. So I think what is needed is more multilateral collaboration in terms of countries coming together and seeing actually what are the real difficulties in scaling up production at this moment. And if those difficulties are due to legal or other kinds of problems that are in your domestic laws, you need to remove them. And then that would, I think, facilitate towards both domestic production and for countries like India also, which would want to export. And I think that it is important that G20 or G77 also should come together and think about how scaling up happens, because we need the right figure to, vaccinate, because at least 70% of the world's population should be immediately vaccinated in the next 1 year or so. Thank you.
Thank you, Yogesh. David.
Yeah, I would just end by saying that there's been an absolute explosion in biopharma research, much to the benefit of mankind, both around the COVID-19 vaccine and around developing frameworks and platforms for vaccines for pandemics of the future. And all of it has been directly as a result of strong intellectual property rights. So we ought to all be stepping back and thanking our intellectual property systems for getting us to where we've gotten so quickly, rather than blaming them.
Well, thank you. All right. Well, I want to note for our audience that video of today's presentation will be posted on both the ITIF homepage as well as the YouTube ITIF website by this afternoon. I would like to thank our audience for joining us today. And lastly, I would like to thank Phil, Azrael, Yogesh, and Dave for joining us as excellent panelists this morning and discussing this very important issue. Thank you all, and we look forward to continuing to collaborate to leverage IP to tackle the COVID-19 challenge. Thank you all.